Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 4, which is all about the cells. So we've talked about anatomy and physiology in a nutshell. So what is anatomy? What is physiology? We talked about the terminology. We talked about the characteristics of all living things. We talked about the human body and the parts of the human body and the organ systems even. Then we went into Chapter 2 and we talked about chemistry, so what makes up the body. Chapter 3 talked about metabolism and how we need energy for, or how we produce energy for metabolic activities. And so this chapter is all about the cells. So the cell is the basic unit of life. And cells produce new cells. So the only, our body is composed of cells, and it's not our organs that do work, it's the cells that actually do the work, that make the organ function. So let's look at what cells look like. Cells are studied through a discipline called cytology. Cytology is the study of cells. Here you're looking at tissue that is made up of cells. And cells haven't been studied for a long time. We couldn't study cells because they're microscopic. So we didn't start studying cells until we had the invention of the microscope. Robert Hooke and Antoine von Leeuwenhoek are two of the first individuals that made microscopes. Theirs were not as powerful as our microscopes that we use in our labs, but they were still very powerful, especially for the time period. So we're looking at the 1600s, 1700s. Cells can vary in size depending on the type of cell. If you're talking about a eukaryotic cell versus a prokaryotic cell. In the human body, we have both, but we're going to look at those eukaryotic cells. And so within eukaryotic cells, within the same organism, our cells can vary, both in size and in shape. So here we have disc-like cells. Here we have cube-like cells, rectangular cells. Here we have cells embedded in a gelatinous substance. Here we have long cells that are cylindrical, and then up here we have these irregularly shaped cells. Cells can vary in size. So here we have a human egg cell. The human egg cell is one of the smallest human cells that can actually be seen by the naked eye. Not all eyeballs can see the human egg cell. You have to be very good. You have to have very good vision, and you have to know where to look to see this size of a cell. So typically we use light microscopy to look at human egg cells or anything smaller, like animal cells, our body cells, or plant cells, organelles that make up our cells, or bacterial cells. Even smaller than these are structures, like the virus, which is a non-living bag of nucleic acid, basically. It has a protein coat around it, and it's got DNA or RNA inside. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates, those are all going to be smaller than even the virus, and then the atom is the smallest. We would have to go to the electron microscopy to actually see individual atoms or proteins. We don't have that. What we have is the light microscope, and so this is where we're going to be focusing on. When you get into microbiology, we'll still be focusing on the light microscope level, which magnifies up to 1,000 times the size of the organism. So there are certain characteristics that all cells have in common, and then specific cell types will have different functions. So all cells have a plasma membrane. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, which contains our DNA, and all of our cells have cytoplasm. So this is just common amongst all eukaryotes and all eukaryotic cells. We all have a plasma membrane, a nucleus, and a cytoplasm. The plasma membrane is a bimembrane or a double membrane barrier that separates the extracellular and intracellular regions. Some of these cells are some plasma membranes, not some cell. Well, they are on cells. Will also contain cilia or flagella or microvilli that will change the function of the plasma membrane to some extent. The nucleus is a very large double membrane structure inside of the cell, and it contains DNA. It also contains smaller structures called nucleolus. The nucleolus is where ribosomes are formed. And then we have the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the intracellular fluid-filled region that contains cytosol, the fluid, and organelles. So let's look at the organelles. There are organelles, in a nutshell, are small little like organs for the cells. They do the job of the cell, just like our heart pumps blood, our liver detoxifies. We have little organs inside of our cells that do the same things, and these are organelles. Some of these organelles have a plasma membrane surrounding them. They are called membrane-bound organelles. And then some don't have that plasma membrane surrounding them. But all of the organelles function to allow the cell to work at its at whatever job it's supposed to be doing. If you were taking a general biology class with me, I would expect that you could memorize the cell structures by looking at them and be able to say, oh, that's the mitochondria right here, or there's the Golgi apparatus, or here's the rough ER. In this class, I'm not as concerned about you knowing the physical structures of the cells, but I do want you to know the functions of each of these organelles. Hold on a second while I yell at my doggy. Not sure why he's crying like that, because, I mean, other than I have a cat by me, but he's going to have to suck it up because my cat's 17 years old, and he needs more lovin's than Dudley does right now. All right. So, I said that cells have certain functions that they pretty much all share, and then there are some functions that are specific to individual cells. So almost all cells are going to have to gain nutrients, produce energy, get rid of waste products. So those are things that we would expect cells to do. They have to maintain cell shape. These are things that just keep the cell's functions working. But some cells have other activities as well, like cell division. Some cells go through mitosis, cell division, and some cells go through a sexual division called meiosis, where you're producing sex cells. So we're going to look at the extracellular region. So no, that's not true. We're going to look at the plasma membrane first. Then we're going to go internal, look at the structures inside the cells. And we'll finish off talking about the, what do I want to say? DNA and RNA. Okay, so this is a longer chapter than normal, so I'll probably have a few more videos than I normally would have. Okay, so we're starting with the plasma membrane. The plasma membrane, in a nutshell, is a membrane built from phospholipids. Phospholipids have a hydrophilic glycerol head and hydrophobic fatty acid tails. The fatty acid tails are going to face away from the fluid. So it's a bilayer, which means there's two layers of phospholipids. The outer layer, the heads face towards the extracellular region and they interact with the extracellular solutions. The inner layer, the heads face towards the intracellular region and interact with the intracellular solutions. The fatty acid tails then face in towards each other and they don't get involved in interactions with the fluid as much. Within the plasma membrane, we have cholesterol. Cholesterol is a steroid molecule that stabilizes and strengthens the membrane. So it's one of its major jobs is it helps the membrane to maintain integrity even when temperature changes occur. We have glycolipids. So glycolipids are carbohydrate groups attached to the phospholipid layers, and they can help form a glycocalyx, which can be protective surrounding the cell, can protect from potential pathogens. We have proteins that embed in the plasma membrane. Integral proteins span the entire membrane, so they are seen on both the extracellular and intracellular regions. And peripheral proteins are only going to be found on one side or the other, so maybe on the intracellular surface or on the extracellular surface. Some of the integral proteins are going to be called glycoproteins. Glycoproteins have a carbohydrate group attached. So here you can see a glycoprotein. This would be an integral protein. That would be a peripheral protein, just on one side, This is cholesterol. Here's some more cholesterol. There's the phospholipid, this whole structure here is the phospholipid bilayer. What else do I want to say? I showed you glycoproteins. I show you glycolipids. Glycolipid right there, okay? So proteins have a lot of functions. We talked about proteins in chapter 2. We talked about proteins in chapter 3, and now we're going to talk about proteins again. So proteins have a lot of functions, and one of those functions in the plasma membrane is proteins can be for transport purposes. So the plasma membrane, in a nutshell, is a semi-permeable membrane that allows certain molecules to cross the membrane while keeping others out. So we have these transport proteins that can help transport molecules from one side of the membrane to the other if they can't go directly across. We have surface receptors. So receptor molecules are molecules that bind other cells. We can have receptors for neurotransmitters. We can have receptors for hormones. There are receptors for a lot of things. Identity markers. Identity markers are basically self-proteins that identify as self, so that your immune system doesn't attack. We have enzymatic proteins that are embedded in the plasma membrane. A lot of times these are your peripheral proteins that will be found on one side or the other, and they catalyze reactions. We have anchoring proteins. Anchoring proteins are going to attach the plasma membrane to other structures. And then cell adhesion proteins can attach cell to cell. Let's stop here and then we'll get into plasma membrane activities in the next video, okay? So I will see you in part 2 of chapter 4.